Hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining our conversations on Paza. Paza, a Swahili word meaning to amplify, is an initiative by Disability Trust. Paza seeks to document and create visibility for the experiences of women with disabilities globally. We look forward to hearing from you, so remember to share your support and feedback on our social media platforms. To continue this conversation, please follow our Twitter page at Paza Podcast. For more content on Disabilities work and projects, please follow Disability on Twitter and Instagram at this_ability_ke and on Facebook at disability.ke. Now, let's get into today's topic of discussion. Thank you very much for joining our platform this afternoon. The conversation for this afternoon's podcast is feminism, women with disabilities, and health, and mainly exploring the experiences of women with disabilities, particularly in light of this global pandemic. And with us this afternoon, we're very pleased to have amazing, strong women with disabilities. And I would like them to begin with some introductions. So, Abby, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Abby. I'm born and bred in Kenya. I've started a project called Walking Autism, which is to raise awareness of autism across Kenya and eventually, hopefully, the continent. Thank you very much for inviting me to this podcast. I look forward to contributing.
Thank you very much, Abby. Maria Njeri, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure, thank you for having me again. My name is Maria Njeri. I live with cerebral palsy and I manage my own awareness and advocacy organization known as Njeri Maria Foundation. And we focus on children and people living with cerebral palsy and how to access early intervention and the right support system, and also known as a noise maker in Kenya.
So my name is Andrea Parra, and I am an attorney by training, and I have been an activist around issues related to disability since 2001. But I've had the possibility to work with different collectives and organizations of women with disabilities, and my area of focus and work is the intersection between gender and disability, and mainly for an advocacy perspective, because I don't identify as a person with a disability. So I've tried to work more from an ally technical perspective, supporting groups of and collectives of people with disabilities in their advocacy work to try to understand the law and the international human rights standards.
Great, thank you. So, as you know, my name is Lizzie Kiama, and I am the founder and managing trustee at Disability Trust, where we work to advance the rights of women and girls with disabilities. And the reason we came up with the idea for a podcast was in light of the work that we do around creating visibility for the rights of women and girls with disabilities, and also providing access to information. And particularly in light of the global pandemic, the situation with the coronavirus, we felt that it was important to begin to document experiences of women with disabilities in emergency health situations. And therefore, we are speaking every 2 weeks with groups of women with disabilities and other stakeholders. And we're very thankful that you all were able to join us this afternoon. So I'll start with you, Abby, and maybe if you could share how communities of individuals and children with autism, especially women, how are they experiencing life in quarantine within this global pandemic?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Lizzie. So in terms of autism, with it still being quite a not a very well-known, not too much is known about it. So services anyway in Kenya are quite lacking, especially when it comes to adults with disabilities, because of there hasn't been too many out, women in the context we'll talk about women who want to disclose that information, because it's still quite a taboo subject. So in terms of general support, there is very little. And in terms of with the quarantine, there is very little support, and especially for the majority of Kenyans who can't access many of these services. Very little help, and of course many of the caregivers, mothers and caregivers who look after their children with autism, there's not much support at all.
Great, thank you. Do you mind talking from a personal experience? Like what has it been like for you, even from a mental health standpoint?
Sure. So for me, with the nature of autism, it is very like we enjoy being by ourselves a lot, and so this quarantine it's good, but it's draining.
Yeah.
I keep myself busy. I'm always working on something, but so I don't mind it too much, but it's getting a little too much now. It's I miss seeing people. And of course, not being able to travel. I can't be able to, for example, come to Nairobi and do a lot of meetings I had planned,
right.
which is frustrating.
Right.
But this is where the internet comes. We're so lucky to have this technology.
Yeah.
When we do now.
Yeah. You mentioned the nature of autism. Could you maybe unpack what that is? Because we're assuming that everyone knows what autism is.
Yeah, my apologies.
No.
So autism is a spectrum of various disabilities, and people either get the message wrong that there is either, like say, the non-verbal or the very high needs to the Albert Einstein end of the spectrum. So, but it's a variety of spectrums. I mean, you can have someone, say, who is non-verbal but extremely articulate and very smart. And I've read a number of books by non-speaking individuals, and they come up with some incredible explanations as to why and how they feel. So it's that misconception of seeing a non-verbal and just assuming. So there's that. And there is the behavior. The behavior is quite a big, I hate to say the word red flag, but that's the doctor version of it. But also behavior, like sometimes, and I often do it too, repetitive stuff, like people like routine with autism. And if a routine is disrupted in any way, like say this corona virus, that's a child with autism, his or her routine is disrupted. So it can be very hard. And communication also, that's another thing of autism. And yeah, like I was saying before, the assumption that if someone is non-verbal, they're not able to understand or do this, but that's wrong as well. Like I learned to talk very I was 3 when I learned to talk, and still it was very mixed up, jumbled. And so some of us do gain speech, and others are not quite able to get there. But that's when there are there are a number of different tools that can be used in place of speech. Sorry, I hope I made sense.
No. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. And just hold on to your comment about tools and that can support individuals with autism. Let's pick that up a bit later. But Maria Njeri, do you mind taking us through the challenges that women and girls with cerebral palsy in this context of the coronavirus? Could you tell us about, some of their experiences?
Cerebral palsy falls into 2 categories in disability. It can be either a physical disability or an intellectual disability. So we have always, even in normal circumstances, have a very hard time in how do we define it, how do we intervene for it. And also that has become the challenge in this time of the pandemic, because one of the cases for women and girls with cerebral palsy, who have more of a physical impairment, then the access to healthcare, such as therapy service, medication, has been limited. And also for those with intellectual disability, we are finding they're becoming more vulnerable because of the social distancing, and now they're more at home, they're more unsupervised and all. So I think those are the 2 main problems women and girls with CP are facing.
Thank you, Maria. I know we've had this conversation, and even in the last session that we had the situation around violence, gender-based and sexual violence for girls, particularly those with intellectual disabilities, was a big concern, particularly now that people are confined to their homes, and sometimes they're confined with the perpetrators of this violence, and they have no, escape. Maria Rosa, do you mind telling us how feminism can play a role in ensuring that we advance health rights for women with disabilities? And why should we take a feminist approach to this conversation?
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Lizzie. I think it's now the crisis that we are living now is showing us in a very, direct way and also cruel way that women and girls are not in the same condition than men. And yeah, especially if we are talking about women and girls with disability, for sure they are not in the same conditions than men. So a feminist perspective or a feminist approach can help us to see the difference that we are living only because our gender. If you born a woman, you don't have the same options than a man. And if you are a girl with disability and the rural areas, maybe for you it's much more complicated to access to healthcare or also to information, or even to new technologies that can teach you how to handle the crisis. So I think a feminist perspective can help us to try to see the reality of women. And by the other side, I mean, we women have a long story trying to build support networks. So I think, yeah, trying to see the crisis from a feminist perspective can also show us how to build these support networks, how to work together, how to handle this new situation that we are living now, and how to support each other. And yeah, I think something that is also very important is now, in the middle of this quarantine, the gender-based violence is growing a lot. So this is another thing that we are women are living now. And I mean, now is time to see what is happening and to do something about it, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. In continuing the discussion around sexual and gender-based violence, and for both you, Abby, and Maria Njeri, some of the issues around legal capacity, that affect the bodily autonomy and decision making of women and girls with disabilities, regardless of the context, but especially when it comes to guardianship and caregiver situations. What are some of the ways that communities of individuals with either CP or autism can begin to protect themselves? And I know it comes from accessing knowledge and information, but what are some other practical tips or resources that you can share that these communities can arm themselves with?
Okay, I'll go. So of course a lot depends on whereabouts a person is. Are they in the rural areas, or are they in the more cities where like say technologies to for instance groups, especially for caregivers and parents with autistic children. I think support makes all the difference. And I know a number of mothers with autistic children who have a online support group, and it makes all the difference when you have someone who understands and who you can talk to, and like you communicate with them a fair amount, and we help each other, and that's the power of community. And in some rural areas that around the country, sadly that isn't happening just yet. So I think the way forward is to try and encourage parents, caregivers, and autistic women themselves. Of course, as I said before, many individuals don't like to, they have nowhere to turn. There's no one to talk to, and it ends up becoming very isolating. And community helps. So I would suggest other support groups, finding support groups and creating one, and that's what I learned from me as well, personal speaking. Until I joined Facebook groups and met with parents and individuals who work with the spectrum in Kenya, it was very isolating for me.
Just picking up on that, before you respond, Maria Njeri, Abby, when you speak about support, the support is directed at who? The caregivers and guardians, or to the individual with disability or with autism?
Of course, it would be both ideally, but as in Kenya, as of right now in Kenya, there aren't very many women or girls with disability who feel comfortable in opening up that discussion because of the stigma and discrimination around it. And I have, given talks to parents who I try to encourage them, explain it to your children, talk to your children, talk to your girls about it, and give them that courage to want to find others. Sadly, it's a very untalked about issue here. So I personally only know 2 other autistic women in Kenya. I'm sure there are loads, tons more, but there's just that stigma still about really opening up and letting people know, yes, guys, I have this. It's not easy.
Thank you. Njeri, do you have something to add?
Wow, I think that was profound, and I'd like to emphasize on what Abby says on the support systems and having the right support systems not only for the girl or woman with a different ability, but for the people who are closest to her, because the people who are closest to her are her biggest enablers. So if they support her and her decisions, then that's a way to go. But also, another thing I'd like to add on that is that the cultural and the medical perspective of it, and having the right processes and systems for them to access the care they need. And Lizzie, if you don't mind, I have a story about a young lady, Emmet.
I don't mind, go ahead.
And she has cerebral palsy, but she has an intellectual impairment, and she sells her body in order to get food or to get a daily living. And now she's pregnant with her second child. And so the family approached to me with a request on, as she gets the second child, can the doctor perform a medical, what do we call it? A medical intervention so she can't have any other children.
To sterilize her, basically.
Yeah, my first question was, is that what she wants? You know? And they told me no, but she can't have other children because she can take care of them. And we have to take care of her children for them. They had even involved the chief and all that. And so I went back to thinking about it from a cultural aspect and how we always say we never want to talk about a woman with disability as a woman or as a mother, and we just take away that right from them. So I guess as we provide the support, let's provide the right processes and how to go about all this. If that makes sense.
Yes, it does make sense. I'm curious about is the conversation still going on with this woman, or did they arrive at a decision? What was the conclusion?
The conversation is still going on. We first ensured that she got the proper prenatal care that she needed, and now we're waiting. We are looking, and also another thing, Lizzie, is there's no written like legal document on how to go about sterilization of a woman with a disability. Like, we don't know how to go about it. Do we need a letter from the chief, or do we need to go see the magistrate? Or there's no legal document on such a procedure.
And I think that is a very common situation also for us here in Latin America. I think what you bring up and I think your instinct is completely right about first establishing what she wants. And the problem, and this is the whole issue around informed consent to specific procedures. Both abortion and sterilization are procedures that only the person whose body is involved should be able to consent to. And the problem is that many times the information that women with disabilities receive is wrong. So they are misinformed about what this procedure means and about what that entails for them. So many times women with disabilities are told that they need to be sterilized because of health reasons, and when that doesn't have any grounds. There is a routinary preference on both on medical personnel, families, to want to sterilize women, so others don't have to take care of their children, which also involves a stereotype about women with disabilities inability to be mothers. So I think that is very important first to ensure that this person has the right information about what the procedure is about to do. I think many times it is true that women with disabilities get pregnant as a result of sexual violence. So I think that's another thing to screen for in this situation. And what happens also that is a very structural problem is that because women with disabilities have very little access to regular education and inclusive education, they receive very little information about sexuality and sexual education. Like, for example, in Colombia, it is mandatory for all schools to teach about sexuality, which is very controversial, but there's a big campaign on the part of activists for comprehensive sexual ed in schools. But because women with disabilities are excluded from the schooling system, they don't have spaces where they receive information. One project that we worked on here was with the main sexual and reproductive healthcare provider to create, they have like a program for youth and education youth, and we worked with them for them to develop and include in their sex ed programs young people with disabilities. So they start learning about their bodies and sexuality. So I don't know the specific situation of this person, and of course you know much more what is the cultural context that she's in, but I think the first step would be to check that she has the right information, that if this is a wanted pregnancy, then she has a right to exercise parental rights and maternity. And one legal framework you were asking for, what I would recommend reading is the General Comment number 3 of the of the UN Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which focuses on women and girls with disabilities, and also the Special Rapporteur's report on sexual and reproductive rights of girls and young women with disabilities has very clear guidelines about education and about informed consent. So the first thing I would say is to first establish what she knows her rights are, what she wants to do, whether she wants to be a mother or not. And there's a whole question of accessibility of information. And no medical personnel should go ahead with a procedure without her direct consent, which is also the other problem that we were facing here in Colombia with guardianship laws that allow for a third party to consent to different procedures. So that's what I would say to begin with. I don't know specifically to which authority, if the chief specifically, or because I'm not that familiar with the local context, but I would first establish whether there has been informed consent properly, and on that there are very clear legal standards on what is informed consent and what information she has to make this decision, to make this an informed decision, and what she wants specifically before taking any steps before authorities or medical personnel.
Thank you.
Just to add on to both Maria and Andrea's point about the right sexual education and for disabled women, very much so. We need that a lot here. And the right, and of course, the education that could be understood by persons with autism, by women with autism and other intellectual disabilities, you know, because as we all know, talking about sex anyway here is quite a taboo subject, so people don't do it. And when it comes to the disabled girls and women, of course, it's totally, no one even goes there. No one thinks that, you know, as disabled women, we have these needs and we have these rights. But of course, sadly, right now, that's not considered.
I think that's so important, Abby. And I think one strategy that we had here, because in all honesty, the disability rights movement doesn't have as much capacity to cover like a whole national context or anything like that. So what we did actually was to first like advocate before the main sexual and reproductive healthcare provider, which is which I think in Kenya it's Mary Stops, or there's an IPPF affiliate in Kenya. So those so what we did is, because this organization has been around for many years here in Colombia, and they cover the whole country. They have clinics and offices in the whole country. So what we first did was to ally with them. So we trained their personnel first, and we developed materials with them so they would start including protocols for providing services to women with disabilities across their clinics. So that was a way in which it's not only DPOs and people on the ground trying to provide sex ed to other people with disabilities, because we don't like, there isn't capacity or resources as much as these organizations that have been around for much longer.
Definitely, yeah, we need to start doing that, and finding ways to for women and girls who learn a different way. We need to find different ways of
absolutely
bringing that conversation to them in ways that they understand and they can speak for themselves.
And there's actually pretty good material that it's accessible sexual education for, like, it's in easy to read materials, and like there's actually good material in English, especially. That's one thing we struggled with, is that in Spanish we don't have a lot of material, but in English there's already a lot of good material on sex ed for people with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities.
I've had a look at some of them. There's some good ones.
Great, thanks. Maria Njeri, do you feel like your question was answered? Do you feel like you have A way forward?
Yes, we have a way forward. I have one question, maybe.
Go ahead.
If she has an intellectual impairment, getting an informed consent is a bit challenging. So how do we go about that? And also, I think the third party rule applies here, that the mother or the father, the caregiver, has the concept over her. So how do we go around that?
So first off, I think the question of how to form the informed consent of her, that's a question of accessible information. The premise is that every person has a will and that every person can express what they want and what they prefer. So the core of the convention is that we focus on a person's will and preferences. So this doesn't mean that a person has to understand a medical contract and the small letter that not even people without disabilities understand. So that's not the point. The point is that there is a way to establish communication, and sometimes with people who have been isolated for a long time in their lives, this can be tricky. But we did a project here, a pilot project with 65 people with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities in various situations. Many people had been isolated in their rooms for their whole lives. And what happened is there was a team of people who started like getting close to the person, building trust, doing like dreams charts, and starting to identify their network of support. The problem with the case that you have, Maria, is that it's a pregnant woman, and pregnancy is a situation that is against the clock. So I didn't understand very well if the question was whether she wanted to have an abortion or whether she wanted to be sterilized during delivery. So those are two different situations. If the question is abortion, then fast things need to be done because the pregnancy advances quickly, right? You only have a very limited space of time. If the question is a sterilization is not a procedure that has to happen during delivery. And you can argue that until she expresses informed consent, the procedure doesn't need to happen. A sterilization, if that's what she wants later, she can have it still. That doesn't have to be during delivery. And my question would be, is the reason why the parents are consenting because she's under guardianship legally, or?
Yeah, she's under guardianship and she's also dependent on her family.
Yeah, dependency doesn't mean that you don't have legal capacity. Dependency is you can be a very autonomous person and have dependency needs for your dress or your food feeding and whatnot. But the fact that you're dependent doesn't make you incapacitated per se. So if she has legal guardianship, we had the same situation here, and we had to fight it, especially. And I think right now, I think it is possible to argue, and we did it here before when we still had guardianship, because we were able to pass a law that eliminates guardianship last year. But we had the same situation, and what we would argue is we would file a challenge before courts saying that even if you're under guardianship, decisions over your sexuality and over your integrity and your bodily integrity should not be allowed to be made by the guardians, even if they can make economic and financial decisions legally. So that's a fight. We had the exact same situation that you're saying, and a lot of parents were the ones authorizing sterilization and abortions and things that were very intimate and personal, and that only the person whose body is involved should be able to make. So I think that's probably a fight. I'm not gonna deny that, and it's probably a fight before the courts to establish some standard that although the Kenyan Supreme Court has some good decisions on sexual and reproductive rights, so I think you can use Kenyan law. If the parents are insisting on sterilization and it's not what she wants, I think you need to go into a legal fight, unfortunately. But that's how we've made a lot of the wins. So I'm happy to put you in touch if that's helpful. But I think that's, yeah, I mean, I think we need to fight for, even if there's even if we are in countries where guardianship is still allowable, we shouldn't allow for very intimate decisions to be made by guardians. And actually there's several like medical statements about sterilization should only be made by the person who's been sterilized, etc.
Super. Thank you.
Prepare for a fight, Njeri.
But probably everybody in this call is a fighter already, so.
We were going to go into how women with disabilities are accessing information, particularly within this current situation, and stories around that. But I think the story that Maria Njeri brought up covers that. So I would just go into the next bit in terms of, are there opportunities to create visibility for some of the issues that are happening now? And probably even riding on what the fight that you're about to get into, Maria.
Yeah, I think I can start with that one. And of course, opportunities for visibility of women with disability are always there, but it goes back and begins with awareness, and also access to the accurate information. Without this too, visibility is not there. So I guess, and as we are speaking, I'm thinking we are experts of knowledge and experts of experience. So if Andrea can share the right information and Abby and you, Lizzie, then we can have a stronger impact on this.
I definitely agree, Maria. You know, there's always opportunities, and the more visible we as disabled women are and can bring forth these discussions and conversations, I think that we can move forward. It will be a fight, but you know, we can do it with we're women.
In terms of increasing visibility and the access to information, particularly now that people are confined to their homes and we are adhering to the social distancing, are there some innovative tools or tips on how women with disabilities or persons with disabilities in general can begin to access information? Because we've had complaints of government addresses around the coronavirus not being accessible to various groups of individuals with disabilities. Sign language is not being provided, and
Right.
you know, information is being sent either via social media, so the assumption is everyone has access to internet, which is not true, or the
Right.
Ministry of Health is sending mass SMSs on mobile phones. So the assumption is everyone is literate, everyone has access to mobile phones or internet. How else can we, what strategies or solutions can we share with possibly the listeners of this conversation?
So I think these type of conversations are key. I think that it is true. The question of access to technology is very tricky. But I think that like low tech options like just phone calls and like conference calls are one option. And like also putting together for people who do have access to internet, like information about their members, like who is out there, who they need to call or they need to reach out to. But here we've also had to fight, like the president didn't have sign language in the initial things, and so, or sometimes media, when the sign language was next to the person speaking, they would just cut them off the screen. Like things like that we see here a lot also. So we've been trying to use social media also to challenge those behaviors. We went to a meeting with the mayor's office that is doing a lot of the aid, like giving groceries and things to people who are impacted by this situation, and also demanded accessibility of all information. And they've done a somewhat okay job, but I think we need as civil society to keep pressuring about this.
Thank you, Andrea. Anyone else?
I think the more we have these type of conversations, and via our pages, and of course, I'm talking for people with access to technology, but I also think even doing, like, even if it's Zoom interviews with various media houses in Kenya, like interviews, maybe recorded interviews. I've tried to get a number going because this month is World Autism Awareness Month. So I'm trying to get a few, Zoom interviews or whatever going with some of these, because that is another way of reaching out to people and getting awareness out there.
And just to add on to it, I think because looking at the Kenyan setup, like the rural setup, I think it's important for this information also to be given out in a language that the women understand. Because if you look at the bulk SMSs that the government is sending out, they are in English. The assumption is everybody will be able to read and understand, which is not the case. So I think it's also important, to make use of language that is understandable, and like we have our local radio stations that is listened, especially in the rural areas, covering different regions. So I think that is also should be a medium that they could use to pass the information, and this speaks in the vernacular languages, so it is more clearer, more understandable. It will speak to them.
Yeah, I think community radios is a great option, and also translation to local languages is very key.
Very much so. I definitely agree.
Yeah, but I also wanted to add that thank you, Minister, for mentioning that, but also going back to the basics. You remember how urgent information used to be given out by the elders of the community or by the gatekeepers? It should also be very nice to see the Ministry of Health using the community gatekeepers to send out information. So that would be another way.
Great. Maria Rosa, do you have anything to add?
Not really. I just want to thank everybody. I learned a lot from all of you now. And yeah, I think now we have, every time that we develop a new podcast, we have more and more questions and more ideas. And I think, that's good for everybody.
I think it would be a good idea to look at the African regional body to see what the human rights standards in the regional body are good, and some are good in disability, and some also are good on gender. So I think using that framework is also useful for the African region.
Great. Okay. So this was around access to information and creating visibility. And Abby, you mentioned the World Autism Awareness Day that is coming up. If there's any way we can support, if even if just amplifying it on our social media, Maria, the same as yourself, it would be nice to support one another, particularly now that we're all stuck at home working online. That's the least I think we can do. So I think it would be useful to share some of these, the things that you're working on, and see how the rest of us can amplify.
Yes, so I have a page on Facebook where I post various articles regarding autism and the rights and information, but as Maria pointed out, the right information, because we all know there's a lot of the wrong information out there. So it's what I post mainly is from a self-advocate, and I do focus more on women's rights. Walking Autism, it's my project. It's a project for the page, Walking Autism. Thank you so much for including me in this conversation. I look forward to many more.
Yes, definitely. Maria Njeri, do you have anything to add about the work that you do?
Because a lot of the work probably for you too is out in the field, so that has stopped or been rescheduled. But you can follow me on Twitter at Njeri Maria too. On Facebook at Maria Njeri, and I think I just want to say the fight continues.
It does.
Yeah.
It does, but we'll get there. We're fighters. Yeah. Our ancestors didn't fight for nothing. Carry on that fight.
Andrea, any parting words?
No, just a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Liz, for your patience and for inviting me. I really hope that we can maybe mediate some conversations with some of the Latin American groups. I'm happy to support translation and stuff. So please keep me in mind for that. I know that many people here would appreciate also having that kind of exchange.
That would be great. Yeah, I think we can definitely figure that out. We've come to the end of our session for today, and we're so grateful for your participation. Let's remember to continue the conversation on our social media platforms. If you would like to join the conversation as a guest speaker or discussant, please get in touch by sending an email to paza@this-ability.org. Remember to like and share our content on Twitter at Paza Podcast. For more content on Disabilities work and projects, please follow Disability on Twitter and Instagram at this_ability_KE and on Facebook at disability.ke. Speak soon and stay safe.